that I'm going to tell you some things that you didn't know about our dear Marquis. And because one of the things that I have discovered since I got involved in all this, which is a wild story, that most people don't really know much about who he is and what he did for us now. And that's really a shame. I think after I tell you all the stuff that I'm going to tell you, you're going to be surprised and hopefully learn quite a few things. So, without further ado, here we are, the hero of two worlds, the Marquis de LaFayette. And before he was our Lafayette, he was born Marie, Joseph, Paul, Yves, Roche, Gilbert de Motier de Lafayette, more commonly known as Lafayette. Thankfully. And this is where he was born. This is the Lafayette rustic home in Auvergne region of France, which is about 5 hours south of Paris. And he was born into an old noble family, and when his father was 2 years old, he was killed by the British at the Battle of Minden. And he was raised by women, his mother and his grandmother and his aunt. And this would have a lot to do with who he became later in life. And here's a early rare portrait of Gilbert as a teenager. And you can kind of tell here's the aristocrat. He's got this beautiful suit of clothes on with lace and things. This is about the age when he led the village boys out to slay this creature that was terrorizing the villagers. I can just see them going out with their little wooden swords. They're going to find this little creature and kill it. It had already been killed. But he grew up on stories of his ancestors who were knights and crusaders. One of his ancestors rode with Joan of Arc.
Oh.
And see, all these stories would become important to who he was and what he did later in life. So here we are. Here he is about the age of 19 when he decided to come to America and free us from the tyranny of King George III. And because his mother and her parents were quite wealthy, and when they died when he was quite young, he becomes one of the richest young men in France. I mean rich, rich, rich. He was very wealthy. And so, fathers with daughters, what are they looking for? A rich young man to marry their lovely daughter off to. So this is the lady that he ended up meeting. She was known as Adrienne, and the Noailles family were a very important, well-connected family in France. So they were secretly engaged by their parents, and then he was 16 and she was 14 when they were married. Now you have to remember, this is another era, and this was a very common thing back then. But they actually became quite smitten with each other. So, time goes on, and eventually Lafayette meets this guy, Silas Deane, who's the U.S. envoy to France. He's there to gather interest in our cause. And he's signing up lots of Frenchmen to come over and help us. In fact, too many Frenchmen, and most of them were mostly opportunists. So when Lafayette appears, he's immediately impressed with him, and he promises him he can be a major general. And my research says that's only short of commander-in-chief. So you can imagine. And so he shows up, and the reception in America is lukewarm because they've been dealing with all these Frenchmen showing up who basically just want to get paid and get a nice uniform and all that. So Lafayette comes to America. His father-in-law forbade him to come. The king forbade him to come because they didn't want to get involved in our war with England. So he leaves behind his pregnant wife. He defied his king, who ordered him not to go. And he risked his life and eventually spilled his blood at the Battle of Brandywine. And he was only 19 years old. So what does a rich young man do to get over here when you've got a burning desire to fight for the cause of liberty? Well, you buy your own ship. That's what you do. Which was worth a year's worth of income. So can you imagine how much that must have cost? So the next thing we know, he lands near Charleston and gets a pretty lukewarm reception, and they tell him that he needs to go to Philadelphia. So he goes to Philadelphia. They literally shut doors in their face, and he finally gets to Washington. And George had been told that this was a young man that was well connected and he had, quite a bit of money. So these two men become very close. George Washington didn't have biological children. Lafayette's father died when he was only 2 years old. So they bonded and had pretty much a father-son relationship. And Washington told him to think of him as a father. And Lafayette always referred to him as his, Washington's adopted son. So that gives you an idea. And the affection was really very close. And somebody else observed that no father could have shown himself more tender toward his son than the general towards Lafayette. So the next thing happens. Lafayette is at the Battle of Brandywine. Now, I'm not a great studier of the battles and everything. In fact, this one's not really considered all that important, but it actually is more important than you might think. So this is the battle where Lafayette gets shot, and he's got blood coming out of his boot, and his aide-de-camp says, "Hey, we need to get you off the field before you get killed." And but this is where he proves his mettle. And he becomes known as the hero of two worlds on both sides of the Atlantic. Word gets back to France that Lafayette is doing the country proud, and so they become puffed up with pride over him. Meanwhile, British General Howe is determined to capture the boy general and send him to the Tower of London. As we know, that didn't happen. So, last summer, I had a chance to go to the site of the Brandywine battlefield near Chadd's Ford, and it's a lovely park now where you can go see it. And I met the author of the book, Lafayette at Brandywine, The Making of an American Hero. Very nice man named Bruce Modi. And just down the road is this fabulous monument to Lafayette. He's not buried there or anything, but they erected this huge monument to him, which is kind of neat. And there's Bruce. And he's the author of our children's book. Would you hold up the children's book? This is the book that our local group bought with a grant from the Bales Foundation, distributed to our local elementary schools. And we went around telling the kids about Lafayette. And one lady on our committee is the state librarian, the DAR librarian, and they bought over $5,000 worth of his book and distributed them throughout the state. So we're trying to educate our young people. That's part of our mission, to educate, celebrate, and commemorate. So there's Bruce. He's a great guy. He was here recently too. So after Lafayette gets injured, he spends 5 weeks convalescing, and Washington sent his own doctor, physician, to take care of him. He wanted to make sure he was treated well. So after 5 weeks, he decides he's got to get back into the action, and he joins Washington at Valley Forge. And then in December, he's given his own division. And even though he had earned his military talents through his friendship with the commander-in-chief and his wealth, which opened the door, he had proven himself. And all told, he spent over 700,000 livres on behalf of the American cause. And that's a lot of money, because he believed in us. So he goes back to France with Washington's blessing to get more help from the French. So he goes home, and Adrian's actually with Marie Antoinette. And so Marie hears that Lafayette is home, so she takes her, and Adrian fainted into his arms. And so the king had to do something because he disobeyed him. So guess what he did? He was on house arrest for a week. Not that serious. So while he's back in France, so he's promoting American products like hemp, timber, and whale oil, and he secures additional help from the French monarch in the way of ships of the line and soldiers. But after a year, he was anxious to come back to the U.S. to aid his beloved Washington, who he wrote, "Oh, my dear General, how happy I shall be to embrace you again." So here we have the decisive battle at Yorktown. And at Yorktown, there was an African-American man named James Armistead. And he was a spy for Lafayette. But the funny thing is, Cornwallis thought he was his spy. And so he was fooled, wasn't he? So there's the man named James Armistead. So one of the things I learned in researching and reading all this stuff is that the black people who took up arms were promised their freedom. Well, this man didn't take up arms. He was a spy. And so in some ways you might say that's actually more important. And so when Lafayette finds out, I don't know, a couple of years or so later, that James Armistead had not been freed, he wrote a letter to the Virginia legislature outlining all that this man had done and asked for him to free him. They did, and he was so grateful, he took the name Lafayette. And at Yorktown celebration this year, we met two of his descendants, whose name is Delaney. So after Yorktown, by the way, did any of you know that there's a Yorktown Day celebration every year? I couldn't believe I did not know this. And I went this year. It was really a very moving experience. And there are over 2,000 French soldiers buried in Yorktown, Virginia, who died for our cause. And people from France come over every year for Yorktown Day. I was just amazed. I was like, how did I not know that?
Where is it held?
In Yorktown, Virginia.
When?
When? October.
October.
Yeah. And it's been held for quite some time. They have a little parade and everything. It was really neat. I need to tell you one thing. Benedict Arnold was supposed to have been at Yorktown. And so good thing for him, because Washington told Lafayette to hang him on the spot if you catch him. Yeah. So after Yorktown, Lafayette goes back to France again, and then returns in 1874, and this becomes a hint of what's to come in 1824 and 1825, because he was cheered everywhere he went. And he spent several days with Washington at Mount Vernon with his family, and this would be the last time he would see his father figure, Washington, alive. So this is a picture of George Washington Lafayette. He had red hair just like his dad. Okay, so what happens to, oh, this is out of order. How did that happen? Oh, darn. Well, so what happens to Lafayette? He goes home to France, and he tries to bring the French people the kind of freedom that we had fought for here. And it didn't go over very well, if you know anything about the French Revolution. So most people believe that the French Revolution began on July 14, 1789. Of course, there were lots of stuff that led up to that fateful day, and of course Lafayette was involved. Lafayette's home became a gathering place for Americans in Paris. Monday night was the night that you went to Lafayette's place and you spoke English. Thomas Jefferson was there because he was the American ambassador to France at that time, and he helped Lafayette write the Declaration of the Right of Citizens, which is very much based on our Declaration of Independence. Well, I don't know. Something happened here. I got out of order. So, Lafayette, things go bad. He becomes despised in France. He has to escape because the guillotine has been erected. So while he's escaping, unfortunately, he gets caught. He's on his way to America, actually, and he gets thrown into this prison called Old Boots. And Old Boots, pretty much, I describe it as a hellhole. It was horrible. He was not treated well, you know, but the world didn't know where he was at this point. And everybody wanted to know what had happened to Lafayette. In the meantime, well, I want to know why this is, I have missed some slides. Somehow some slides have gotten out of order. So in the meantime, Lafayette's wife is imprisoned. Her mother.
That's the next one.
No, that's
Adrian and daughters.
Yeah, but Adrian and his wife, her mother, sister, and grandmother are all in prison during the French Terror. And unfortunately, the mother, the sister, and the grandmother all went to the guillotine. And Adrian's on the list. And if it weren't for the Monroes, Elizabeth and James Monroe, and a guy named Luther Morris, who was there in Paris at the time, Adrian might have gone to the guillotine as well. They pretty much said, Lafayette is beloved in our country. It just wouldn't be good for, international relations, if she goes to the guillotine. So Elizabeth Monroe goes to visit her in prison, and that kind of helped the whole situation. And then 5 days later, the French Terror is over. Robespierre has his own head cut off, and she gets out of prison. So then she decides that, she's got to find out where her husband is, and she decides to go see if she can get him out of prison. In the meantime, the son has been sent to America to be under the care of George Washington, his godfather, because his name is George Washington Lafayette. So they go, and the Emperor of Austria wouldn't let him out. He hated Lafayette because he was against, what Lafayette stood for. And Marie Antoinette was an Austrian princess. He blamed Lafayette for not saving the royal family. Because, what fate that they met. So she said, well, if you won't release him, then my daughters and I will go into prison with them. At this point, they hadn't seen each other for 4 years. And he's very thin and threadbare, and you can only imagine how wonderful it must have been, to see them and have him, join. I mean, I just can't imagine how joyful that must have been. But, that's really love, to put yourself into a horrible situation like that, with your husband. But later, one of her daughters said it was actually the 2 best, she would say it was the 2 best years of her life because she had him undivided all to herself. So think about that. So they lost everything in the French Revolution. All their properties were confiscated. So when they got out of prison, and by the way, guess who got them out of prison? Napoleon. Napoleon helped get them out of prison. But he didn't want Lafayette back in France because Napoleon wants to be an emperor for life. This is the absolute opposite of what Lafayette stands for and what he wants France to do. So he wasn't allowed back in. So, but Adrian sets about to get back at least some of what they had lost. And one of the properties she got back was LaGrange, we would say LaGrange, which was one of her family homes outside of Paris. And so that became their family home, and they lived there for quite some time. Unfortunately, Adrian in prison contracted something. Nobody that I know of has ever figured out exactly what it was, but her arms, her limbs swelled up, her skin started peeling off. The doctor, they called for a doctor, he said, you really should leave, but he said, if you do, they won't let you come back. And so she refused to leave. She put her life at risk. So they come back, and they're living here, and Adrian, unfortunately, in 1807, becomes ill again. But here's a neat picture I found of Lafayette's bedroom, and I'm pretty sure that's George Washington there, don't you think? Mm-hmm. So he had in his bedroom all the, the busts of the important people and documents and things, which I think is kind of neat. And so there's poor Adrian. So on Christmas Eve, which is actually George Washington Lafayette's birthday, she becomes ill. Actually, it was a whole month-long process, poor thing, and she died. And Lafayette was devastated, and it's said that for the rest of his life, every morning he had her miniature, and he spent a few moments in devotional to her. Because I'm not sure, but I think he didn't really truly appreciate her until she was gone. She did an awful lot. So fast forward to 1824. Lafayette's doing his thing over in France, but we're looking forward to the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And we have just gone through a very divisive election cycle, and the country's divided. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? And Monroe wants to invite Lafayette back because he's the last living Major General of the Revolution, because he was only 19 years old. And so Lafayette says, yeah, I'll come back. And he was only going to stay for 3 months. But then he gets here, or word gets out that he's coming. Everybody said, come to our town, come to our state, we want you. And you can only imagine what it was like. So he arrives, you know, in New York City. There's a military escort for him. And, you know, the country has changed dramatically. There was only 3 million Americans at the time of the Revolution. There's now 12 million people. There were only 13 states. Now there's 24 states. So he traveled through all 24 states on riverboats, half-completed roads, and frequently honored by escort militias. And he literally had an entourage. You know, I'm not that sure they had that word back then, but that's the word. He had an entourage everywhere he went. And he was, you know, honored and treated as the nation's guest, and that's what he was called. So he arrives in New York City on August 15th, 1824. Thousands of people are there waiting for him and shouting, "Vive Lafayette!" And you can only imagine. So this building is called Castle Clinton. It was surrounded by water. Now it's been filled in, so you can just walk right up to it. And I found out that's like the original Ellis Island. So that was an immigrant. You know, you came there to report that you were coming into the country or something. I thought was interesting. And it is said that he burst into tears at the reception. We hadn't forgotten him. And a rainbow appeared.
Oh.
I know, isn't it lovely? So here's one of our 5 Lafayettes. This is Mark Schneider. He's the one that I know, and he works at Colonial Williamsburg, and he's a great Lafayette. So he's on a boat, sailing into the harbor. Here's a friend of mine and I there at the celebration, waiting for Lafayette to land. And here's Lafayette number 2. He came down one day and snuck in part of the deal. His name is Ben Goldman. And here we are at Francis Tavern. This is all last August in New York City for the kickoff.
Love your dress.
Thank you. And we got to go to some cool places. This is City Hall in New York City. And inside City Hall, there's my friend Kathy and I at one of the other events. Inside City Hall, in the room where they have their business meetings, there's a full-length portrait of George Washington. And these ladies are descendants of George Washington Lafayette. They came over from France. This is Virginie and her 2 daughters. And Virginie's also a member of the DAR. She's the registrar for the Rochambeau chapter in Paris.
Was she named after the state of Virginia?
Yes.
Oh.
Well, her ancestor was, yes. Yeah. So, and then on the other side, there's the Marquis de LaFayette.
Oh.
Isn't that awesome?
Without a uniform, yeah.
Really? So here's the trail, Lafayette's Trail. So he was only going to stay 3 months. He ended up staying 13 months, visiting all 24 states, and traveled 6,000 miles. And get this, he was 67 years old. I mean, can you imagine? It's not easy now. You can imagine what it was then.
It was pretty elderly for a person then, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, so that gives you an idea. And here's the White House in 1825. So he spends quite a bit of time around, the D.C. area. And he attended celebrations at the sites of Bunker Hill, Yorktown, and Brandywine. He made around 500 stops by my count. I mean, like everybody, they knew you were going to be in the area. He wanted you to come and see. So here in Indiana, in Jeffersonville, we had a banner, and we've had it duplicated. That says, "Indiana welcomes Lafayette, the champion of liberty in both hemispheres." So everywhere he went, he was greeted by Masons, the governor of the state, local dignitaries, old veterans from the Revolution, who frequently asked him, "You remember me?" And he always said he did. Here in Jeffersonville, a man named Zalman Burke came to meet him, and apparently he really did know him. They hugged and cried. And his descendant showed up last year, his 5 great-grandson, who lives in Carmel, Indiana, and he's supposed to come down in May and be part of our celebration. which I think is really cool. But one of the neat things, this red book down front, so Lafayette brought a secretary with him who wrote amazing amount of information about where they went, who they met, and one of the things that I gleaned from this is that people were so proud to show him our town, our community, and he was really moved by that because, you know, this is what he had helped them found. And our American Friends of Lafayette president realized about 20 years ago that no one had ever taken the whole book and from French and put it into English, and it took him about 3 years to do it. With Latin and a French, you know, having taken Latin and French, he was able to do it, which is pretty cool. So here's Lafayette opening the lodge because Lafayette was a Mason. Lafayette became a 33-degree Mason in New York City, which is the highest, I guess, you can go. This is really cool. So George Washington's campaign tent was still around when Lafayette came back. The whole story of this campaign tent is interesting. So it followed him all up and down the river. And he knew immediately what it was when he saw it and became emotional because he spent a lot of time in there with the commander-in-chief, you know. And so this is some of the educational banners that the American Friends of Lafayette have had made, but I like how it, you know, tells the story of 13 months, 21 days, 6,000 miles. And of course, you know, we Americans, we like our merch. And so there was quite a bit of merchandise. The story goes that when a lady would, you know, proffer her hand, he was like, I can't kiss my own image, you know, so he would kiss up here. But you know, on his way to Louisville, his steamboat sank at an area now called Lafayette Springs. It's Candleton, Indiana, and there's a historic marker there now. And apparently quite a bit of correspondence was lost. He had a tremendous correspondence with people all over the world. And Gene says he lost his toupee there, but his son went and rescued it. Here's another one of the pretty pieces of this beautiful lady's fan. And a ribbon. Now down here we have a ribbon that we had reproduced that says Jeffersonville and Louisville on it. You're certainly welcome to take it. It would be lovely if you came back on May 12th and wore it. And then that would be beautiful to have. So towards the end, he makes a pilgrimage to Mount Vernon, where he received a gold ring containing Washington's hair. The secretary, Levasseur, described his visit to Washington's tomb. Lafayette descended alone into the vault, and a few minutes later reappeared with his eyes overflowing with tears. He took his son and me by the hand and led us into the tomb. We knelt reverently by the coffin, saluted it with our lips, and retired, all bathed in tears. Because George had been long gone by the time, you know, Lafayette came back. And so while he was here, he laid cornerstones for monuments honoring Generals DeKalb, Greene, and Pulaski. Here in Jeffersonville, everywhere you went, there was a lot of toasting going on. And here he toasted to Nathaniel Greene, so they must have been very good friends, and he remembered him well. And so he also visited John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison while he was here. So he had a lot of people to see, and it would be the last time they would ever see each other. So on September 6th, Lafayette celebrated his 68th birthday here. And John Quincy Adams hosted a combined birthday and farewell dinner at the White House. And 2 days later, Lafayette boards a new frigate called the USS Brandywine. The Brandywine is the battle where he was injured, so that's why it's called. And then I found out that there was supposed to have been a midshipman from each of the 24 states, but there was nobody from Indiana, but there was a young man from Kentucky, and his name was James W. Marshall from Henderson. And I had my DAR ladies trying to find descendants of this man. So he's going back to France with all these young men, And he's got something with him that he himself had acquired, a chest of American soil. Okay, so Lafayette is everywhere. You may not have realized it. Lafayette is everywhere. This is his statue in Washington, D.C.
Where is it?
You know, I didn't write down the exact location. I just know it's in D.C.
That's
And you
pretty
know there's
good.
Lafayette
I think
Square
it's
across
next
from
to
the White House
the
too.
Adams Hotel.
The Adams Hotel?
In St. John's Episcopal,
Ah,
right on the edge of it.
okay. There's a statue in Baltimore. This was dedicated in 1924 with Calvin Coolidge in attendance. And then here's one in Brooklyn. This is by Daniel Chester French, 1917, very famous
Mhm.
sculptor.
Right.
And here we are in Philadelphia. And of course, Lafayette, Indiana, in front of the courthouse.
That's really pretty.
I live in Lafayette Township in Floyd County, by the way. And here we have in Hartford, Connecticut. I've seen that one in person because I have friends in Connecticut. And then we have another one in Manhattan that was done in 1876 by Bartholdi. And who knows what else famous that Bartholdi did? The Statue of Liberty.
Yeah,
Liberty enlightening the world.
that's a
And
great
I've seen his
statue.
birthplace in France, Colmar. So Lafayette goes home, and he spends the remaining years of his life doing what Lafayette did. He advocated for the abolition of slavery. He advocated for women's rights. He advocated for the right to have whatever religion you wanted, because you know in France, during his lifetime, if you weren't Catholic, then your children were illegitimate, your marriage wasn't legitimate. That's why my French ancestor left France, I'm pretty sure, because they were Protestants. So he's doing all that, and then one day he goes to a friend's funeral, and there's a cold rain, and he catches pneumonia. And it did him in. So he died May 20th, 1834 at the age of 76, which is a pretty, pretty good age. And you can see there that his family and his daughter, they're there with him. When President Jackson hears that he has passed on, he ordered that he receive the same memorial honors that had been bestowed on George Washington in 1799. And John Quincy Adams gave a eulogy that lasted 3 hours. I know. Fortunately, my talk's not going to be that long. So here's George Washington Lafayette in older years. He lived to 1849. And this is the presumed painting of the daughter Anastasie, and her middle name's Marie Antoinette. And this is Virginie Lafayette. And in 1899, the first ever commemorative silver dollar in the U.S. was authorized by Congress to honor Lafayette's contributions. And it sold for $2 at the time. 50,000 coins were sold, and the proceeds going towards the Lafayette Monument Fund. And this statue in Paris was originally erected at the Louvre, and then it was moved, later relocated to the right bank of the Seine. But it's called the Children's Statue because the children also collected pennies to help pay for the statue, to thank them for the Statue of Liberty, which I think is kind of cool. And so here we are. So the story about Adrienne and her family is very interesting. So there's 2 stories. So eventually, somebody came to Adrienne and told her where her mother's sister and grandmother were buried, because they chopped your head off and took your body and just dumped it in this pit. And so they found out where they were, and it was a place called Picpus. And there's a convent on the other side of that wall, and this is as close as they could tell to where her beloved family members were buried. So she and her sister started a subscription service to establish this cemetery because there's so many victims of the Revolution. And so she's buried there, and then Lafayette is buried there. And his son, George Washington, then put the American soil on his grave, in his grave, which I think is really neat. So every year, on or about the 4th of July, the SAR, the DAR, and the Society of Cincinnati have ceremony there. They put a wreath on Lafayette's grave, and American flag always flies there. So in World War I, American soldiers with John Pershing marched to Lafayette's grave and said, "Lafayette, nous voilà," which means Lafayette, we are here. He had helped us, now that we were there to help them. There he is in his French Parisian Guard uniform. And so his legacy lives on through his military service, his human rights, and the American Friends of Lafayette. Last December, so how many times have you seen our Congress people there doing their job? Did you really know that that was George Washington over there overlooking the proceedings, and there's the Marquis de LaFayette? It's been there since 1857.
Congress? Yeah. House of
But usually,
Representatives.
they're kind of like right, they go right here. But that painting has been actually in the Capitol since 1825. It arrived just after Lafayette left, but it's been in that location since 1857. I was like, how did I not know that? So then last December, there was a reenactment of Lafayette's address to Congress, the first foreign-born person to address Congress in what's called Statuary Hall. Number 19 is one in that painting, by the way. And I got an official invitation to go, so I had to go. And did a little research. So this room is called Statuary Hall, which is right off of the rotunda. And her name is Cleo, and she is writing down history. Isn't that cool? So, and the other thing, so there's Mark being Lafayette addressing Congress, and then he returns. So there's so much to this story that it's amazing. And I have to say that the Hamilton the musical brought Lafayette kind of back up, bubbling to the top to know more about him. So here on May 10th, we have a dinner and a ball at the Pendennis. Earlier in the day, there's going to be a reenactment of him setting foot in Portland, like he did 200 years ago. And then on Monday, May 12th, Lafayette will be proceeded over the Big Four Bridge from Louisville into our Big Four Park here in Jeffersonville. And he will speak, and we're going to have hopefully the Old Guard Fife and Drum Chorus coming, and some local dignitaries. And then the DAR is going to take us walk just a few steps over to what's called Veterans Memorial Park, where there are actual Revolutionary War soldiers buried there, Civil War soldiers buried there, and they're going to have a little ceremony there. And the Masons are going to come. The Grand Master is coming down. They're going to have their own marker that they're going to dedicate about his Masonic history. So I can't believe it's almost here after talking about it for almost 2 years. So I'll be glad to try to answer any questions. I hope you've been entertained, that you've learned some new things about Lafayette that you didn't know.
Do you have a flyer on that?
Yes, we do, right here,
Okay.
right back here,
Okay.
that you can take with you, yes.
Did the wife take care of the land back in France while he was over here? And also, was he given any American land? I thought
Yes,
he
he was. In fact, I've got a great little story about that. So I have these older friends that I've known for quite some time. They came to see me talk at the Harrison County Historical Society. They live in across the river in Battletown, Kentucky, but his family is originally from Beebe. And he told me, he came up and said, I got a letter that Lafayette wrote. And I said, how do you have a letter that Lafayette wrote? He said, well, the story of my family has come down that it was given to somebody in our family to pass it on to somebody. They never found that person. So about a month ago, he finally got around to making a copy of it, and it was to Akil Marat, who was the mayor of Tallahassee, Florida, which is the land that Lafayette was given. He wanted to sell it because he was never going to go live there. And it was all in French, and so they had somebody decipher it, and that's what it was about. Yeah.
And did his wife take care of the land, or who?
Yeah, she kept everything, of course, you know, she was the great woman behind the great man. She kept everything going because he had all kinds of things going. One of the things was he bought a couple of plantations in French Guiana to take enslaved people there, to educate them, teach them, you know, a skill so they could be free black people. Well, Napoleon confiscated, that all got confiscated, and then it's been erroneously reported that when he was trying to get back everything, they offered him 100,000 livres, but the slaves had to stay slaves. And Lafayette actually said no. I mean, this is a man who's lost everything. He's really poor now. I mean, you can imagine. And so he negotiated with them, and finally they said, okay, we'll free the slaves, and he got liberated. But somebody in The Hero of Two Worlds, which is the first book I read by Mike Duncan, it's really a very good book, but he had told the story where Lafayette took the money, and I'm like, man, I find that hard to believe, but he didn't. He stuck to his guns. That's how principled he was. So, yeah. Any other questions?
I want to say, have you all been watching that PBS series on Marie Antoinette that's on Sunday
I watched
evenings?
the first series, but I haven't watched the second one
But
yet.
Lafayette's been in several of the episodes, and in one episode,
Make him sound like a windy.
well, he's begging the king for money all the time and stuff. But anyways, it's a really good thing. If you've not seen it, it's I videotape it, or not video, but
No, I
tape it
haven't
and
seen
watch
it.
it.
I
It's worth watching. The costumes and it's filmed at Versailles and all that. So
I watched the first series. I haven't seen the second one yet. Well, you know, there's if any of you ladies watched Outlander, there's a very handsome young Frenchman that was at Lafayette in Outlander. And I sent his picture to the current our friend Chuck, who's the COO, and he said Lafayette was never that good. This guy's really handsome.
Looks too bad.
He's not too bad looking, no. But you know, and you know, he became bald. He wore a little hairpiece, you know. So. Any other questions?
yeah, any other questions?
Yes.
I was just curious, why did Napoleon release him if they were so different in principles?
I think he admired him. Really, I do. I think he admired him, and what had happened to him wasn't really fair. And it's a good thing he did, because I don't think the Austrian emperor was ever going to let him out. He probably would have died in there. Because he ended up spending 5 years in there.
Mm.
They did try to escape, and it didn't work. So, you know. Somebody had a question, yeah?
There's a fine PBS documentary on Lafayette himself. I don't know if you've seen that.
I don't
It came
know.
out a couple of years
A
ago.
couple years ago. Oh.
It's you can
I'll have to
Google
look-
it and
yeah, I'll
find
have to look
it,
it up and,
but
yeah.
yeah,
I've been disappointed there hasn't been like a movie or series about all this. I just, early on I heard there was somebody interested, but apparently just it never happened, so.
and I also was going to say, I think on the Louisville side, if I remember it correctly, he had the grand welcome him over there, and there was a procession out to Locust Grove, Roger Clark's home. And he went-
No, he didn't go to.
He didn't go though?
No,
Okay.
no, but by that time, Mr. Cron was dead, you know. He did not go out there, because I used to work at Locust Grove. But they have a picture of him in there, but no, he didn't go there. But they did have a lovely procession. There used to be a Lafayette Street, it's now Liberty Street. The Masons, you know, everywhere he went to all the Masonic lodges, he went to the Abraham Lodge, and the Scottish Rite was going to have a program on Monday night. Somebody back in, I think 1957, which would have been his 200th anniversary of his birth, wrote a play about Lafayette coming to town and visiting the lodge, and so they're going to reenact that. It should be fun. Yeah. Yes.
I think I read that he went to a girls' school up east somewhere, and the school is there today. And the women wrote poems about him, and he sent 3 of the poems back to his daughters in France or something.
There's so much. That he visited a girls' school in Lexington. Fayette County is supposed to be the first place named for him. Fayetteville, North Carolina is the first town named for him. I mean, there's just so many, anything to do with Lafayette or Fayette, LaGrange, Versailles, Paris. That all this naming stuff happened mostly after his tour in 1824 and 1825. But according to Alan Hoffman, New York State takes the cake. They've got more places named for Lafayette. You take LaGrange, put a Ville, LaGrangeville, So, yeah, it's kind of amazing. And actually, I think he ranks number 5 in our founding fathers, and he is a founding father. Places named after him, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Lafayette. I mean, that's pretty amazing. Actually, the little town that I grew up in was called Fayetteville, and I don't think a single person there had a clue that it was probably named for Lafayette.
Bonnie,
Yes.
ask them if anybody knows the story of Lafayette's watch, the pocket watch. If you don't know that story, we've got a little exhibit in the
Oh, do
theater.
you?
Yeah,
Okay.
about Lafayette's watch that was stolen from him at Nashville, Tennessee. Of course, Nashville had a huge reception for Lafayette. There was a ball in the evening, a little different from Jeffersonville. And his pocket watch was stolen in Nashville. And of course, he was heartbroken about it because it was the watch that George Washington had given him, a gold watch, with an inscription from George Washington to Lafayette, and then there was a carving on the other watch case part. And come to find out, the watch was discovered in a pawn shop in Louisville, Kentucky. Yes, at a sale, and it turns out the story is that it was stolen by a man who was the head of a poor family, probably stolen at the ball, where he may have had some entrance that he could, maybe he was helping with food, could be. And so the watch was actually pawned many years later by the daughter of this family. The family was extremely poor. I don't think they could read, because she always knew it as Lafayette's, not Lafayette, but her father's pocket watch. And it says right on there, Lafayette. So she pawned it so she could get food for her family, and it wound up in Louisville, and it was discovered in 1870. Well, of course, by this time, Lafayette is gone, and the Congress bought the watch, and they located Lafayette's grandson, Oscar Lafayette, still alive, and they sent a delegation to Paris from the United States and presented the pocket watch to him.
Oh, wow, that's a great
And he
story.
cried.
Oh, wow.
So we have a picture in here of the pocket watch in the movie theater as Lafayette is visiting Mrs. What was her name? Isn't this awful? It's awful to be old, you know it?
Tell me about it.
Fuller. The meal was cooked, as you heard Bonnie say, by Fuller's Tavern and all the ladies in Jeffersonville. And it was served at a banquet out on the riverbank. And many toasts were drunk there. And so after things were over, Lafayette went to Fuller's Tavern and thanked Mrs. Fuller and Mr. Fuller for the food that they had been served that day. So it was a big deal here in Jeffersonville. Not quite as grand as Nashville, but we only stole his overcoat.
Yes.
Yes, it's true.
On it later.
And I think Indiana politicians raised the money to buy him a new overcoat.
Yeah.
So I'm having a copy of the new one made. It's not here yet, but that's fine because we stole it and he didn't have it when he was here. So if you'd like to walk around and see the various exhibits, this board right here is all about Lafayette's visit to Jeffersonville and names all the toasts and goes through all that. And then there's a tiny exhibit over there that shows you what Governor Posey's mansion looked like, and that's Lafayette spent the first 3 hours he was here inside because it was raining. left his overcoat in there apparently, and then when he came back after the meal to get it, it was gone. So, and then of course in the theater we have something little, and thank you ever so much, and thank you for allowing Bonnie to come here and speak.
Yeah.
It was great, Bonnie. Thank you.
There are books down here, there's our flyers and our ribbon,